community, right? Because they had to, they couldn't marry commoners. They had to go get a partner from another empire or whatever. So there's this consolidation of power in what at the first was empires, and then gradually becomes countries. Now, I'm not sure, does anybody know the consolidation of states occurs, it's starting to occur then, but I don't think really the consolidation of European states doesn't really get going until 100 years later, right? Is that right, Dan?
I think so.
Yeah. So we're kind of in, pardon?
Going back to high school classes.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Well, but I think you have to reach, I had a professor one time that talked about a climate of opinion. And he said what's interesting about Darwin is that Darwin, actually the Wealth of Nations, which was all about competition, was published before Darwin. So there was a climate of opinion that was about competition. Well, there's a climate of opinion that has empires controlling the world and dividing up the world. And the Pope is setting himself up as kind of the judiciary and the guy that's handing out the deals. And that's all happened before. And then, who remembers their Columbus history? Columbus is Italian, but he flies under the flag of pardon?
Portugal.
Portugal or Spain?
Spain.
Spain, yeah, he flies under the flag of, so there's all this jockeying around as to who's in charge, and then this whole era of exploration. So we got Portugal and Spain competing, and then pretty soon the English get involved and they start competing, right, for colonies. And so there's this competition going on, and Columbus stumbles into America. Right? And he stumbles into America thinking he's somewhere else. And what does he do immediately?
Sinks his flag.
Pardon?
He sinks his flag in
He
the ground.
plants his flag, that's right.
Yeah.
He plants his flag, and then he starts shipping slaves back to Europe. And then Indian slaves. And people don't realize that Indians were enslaved way before we brought black slaves to the Americas. And that's somebody's got 1493 up there. Anybody read 1491?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, well, that basically, my understanding is that Indians, either when they enslaved them, if they enslaved them in the Northeast or the Southeast, they ran away. And if they took them to the Caribbean, they died of malaria.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when they started bringing in the Africans. Am I getting that about right from 1491?
Sure, I read that.
Anyway, but Columbus starts shipping slaves back, and then that whole book, 1491 and 1493, is about the Columbian Exchange. Rather than it being talking about the discovery of America, what it does is says in 1491 or 92, when Columbus gets here, it sets off this series of exchanges. So from the old world, we bring horses and cows and pigs and chickens and diseases, and from here we get, from the new world, we get potatoes and tomatoes and avocados and rubber and any number of other things, and there's a huge exchange that goes on. So in 1493 they talk about the exchanges also that brings in Asia into the exchange route, and gold and silver are also from here, and guano is a big goes to Europe. So that, you know, there was this series of exchanges. So, but the big deal is, what are we going to do with these new people who don't know about Catholicism or don't know about Christianity? Well, first of all, we have to decide whether or not they are people, okay? Because didn't the gospel say something about the preaching the gospel to the world? And so the people assume that the world all knew about Christianity. So if the world knew about Christianity, how could these people not know about Christianity? And therefore, did they have souls? And it took a while. It was in the 1530s, I think, and the Pope had another papal bull, and he decided that, in fact, that he said two things. He said that you can't make slaves of them, and they have souls, so you can convert them. Okay?
Interesting.
But in the first thing he had to do was sort out this whole deal with Spain and Portugal. So that becomes the Doctrine of Discovery. God, some of these things are, my copier wasn't so good, just take one and pass it around. But that's 1493. And the Doctrine of Discovery basically says that if you come to a heathen nation, then the first Christian nation, basically thinking the Portuguese and the Spanish, can plant their flag and they own that nation. And meaning, what does Columbus actually say? Plants it in the name of Queen Isabella or something? Mm-hmm. So you're planting it for the crown, basically. And so that's what happened. They're planting it for the crown, and there's competition, and so the Pope says, Portugal and Spain, you're not going to compete, so, or I've got to sort out the problems, so the first guy that gets there, plant your flag. Which goes right up to us planting the flag on the moon, probably, right? And planting flags on Antarctica and everywhere else. So,
And mountaintops.
Weird.
and mountaintops, and yeah.
Ocean bottoms.
Pardon, and ocean bottoms, yeah. So anyway, the Doctrine of Discovery was in the breast milk of Europeans and even of Americans when they first came here. In fact, you could make the argument that Americans were in a way trying to break away from that because they came from Europe where they were under the thumb of a monarchy and a royalty, and they wanted to have, and what did they want? They wanted their own land, right? And there's a whole literature, I think that Jefferson is the guy who really imagines this as a country of landowners. And I just read something recently where Jefferson sends out these surveyors out, because you got to divide everything out so that you can basically sell land. I meant to look up how much money before we had the income tax, we could sell Indian land. That's how the government ran for quite a while in this country. So anyway, there's what you have, this Doctrine of Discovery, and I think that's kind of a clever. If you can understand any of the English there's a translation. There's a excerpt, but it all goes to say that it's all about planting your flag.
Well, there's a lot of evidence now that the Norwegians were here long before Columbus, so why don't we go by their doctrine?
Yeah, but that was before the Doctrine of Discovery, so the Vikings weren't part of the they had lost influence, but they still had held on to Iceland and Greenland.
And the ones that came west weren't Christians. They were
Yeah,
kind of
that's so.
escaping from Christianity, was trying to take over their worlds.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
So you think even the Scandinavians who were fleeing, there was getting to be Christian pressure there?
Yeah.
Okay.
How many kings or queens were there that received this papal bull? I mean, if you think about it, there was a queen in Spain and there was a king in Scotland.
Well, the Pope, because the two most powerful outfits were Spain and Portugal, and that's who he was basically. And England at that time was still Catholic.
Well, what king was that?
What king was in England at the time?
14,
One of the Henrys, I think.
the Henrys?
Yeah.
I don't know my kings and queens.
So
in
he would have sent all of this out to each of those kings and queens, right?
Yeah, the word would have been gotten out to all of them. And I would imagine the same way. If a lesser lord or military man captured land, he took it in the name of the crown, right? In the name of that
Yeah.
king.
Well, what I was meaning is the money came from the kings. And when he gave people, he told them to go out and,
Well, the money came in two ways. It came up from the peasants with their crops, which they did on, I mean, that's feudalism,
That's
right?
feudalism, yeah.
So that, you know,
Although by this point, actually, we're sort of at the end of feudalism, with the rising, that's just about when.
I don't know, does anybody have a handy date on when we consider the feudal, I mean, it's different in different countries, because Russia is considered feudalistic until
Yeah,
1900, you know,
right, right.
until the Russian Revolution
but I
probably.
mean, the kings fueled the ships that went out to discover all
They paid
these
for it, they
places and
sponsored them.
Yeah,
sponsored them
Yeah.
and all that, and
yeah.
so the money came,
Oh, yeah, the money,
I mean, the papal bull was from the Pope, but the money, you have to see it both, you have to see both halves. There was a
The
lot of
money-
money
yeah, the money came from trade. And,
from the.
you know, if you want to go to this point, and right at this time, not much after 1500, there were several countries that were sending boats to northeastern United, offshore there, in Canada and the United States, for fishing for cod, right? And then it was the first, in fact, the Squanto, the Indian, the fishermen would sometimes put into port and pick up some Indians and send them back as slaves. And then they started picking up furs, and that kind of ignited the beaver industry, because England wanted beaver hats. So, and they'd about trapped all the beaver out of Europe, and so there was a new source of it.
But all the gold and silver they took out of South and Central America too was fueling an awful lot of the economy, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah. And
So what came first? These doctrines sort of incentivized and fueled the drive to go
Conquer somebody else's land.
claim these new lands, but they may not have even realized resources were there to be exploited and brought back and traded. So it seemed like this thing is really at the core of it.
yeah, I'm sure that promoted more of it, but it had been, I mean, I think we have to think that earlier in the mid 1400s, that Portugal and Spain were actually competing in Africa for slaves and for resources. So they were already getting, you know, and they were trading with Arab slave traders. So there, you know, there was,
And it
but
was
it's,
over exploitation of their own resources in their home territories
yeah,
that was pushing this too, so.
sure,
and
yeah.
so, and part of the wealth that they would gather from the colonies also did go back to the Pope, because the monarchs. the
Oh, yeah.
monarchs would, you know, I mean, it was the lords, I mean, the manors were fueled by the peasants on feudalism, who then paid the monarchs, and at this point, we're beginning to have a sense of nation, and there were monarchies rather than just lots of lords, but then they would pay the Pope, so the Pope was incentivized as well by this, yeah.
Yeah.
What I was wondering is which came first? Did they make this up to justify all the money that they were getting? Or did they make,
Who's
did this
they?
happen first before they went out?
You know, I think the point is, and that was,
Justification is what I was thinking.
that was her point, Lorenzo's point, is that there is a climate of opinion. There is this settled in everybody's mind that land is owned by the monarchy and by the people, and that, so we're sorting that out. Yeah, there's money transactions, and the Pope's gonna get his share, and the kings are gonna get their share, and we're gonna work out this trade deal. We're beginning to get a mercantile class, probably, in the late 1500s and early 1600s. You got the Hudson Bay Company, the East India Company. I mean, we're getting the spice route from India. So yeah, there's trade going on, and the mercantile class is growing. And the mercantile class, frankly, doesn't give a damn about property, right? They'll let the crown have the property. A good example of this, and Alvin wrote about it, is the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company was given a charter by the crown in England for basically about half of Canada. But they didn't do settlements. They weren't interested in settlements. They were a commercial company, and they were interested in pelts and furs. And they marched across Canada, collecting those furs and sending them back. And they marched, and the reason they got out here, once they got over it, they had about denuded the eastern half of the country, right? And they then got over the Rockies, and we've got more. And so they kept going, and then when John Jacob Astor, John Jacob Astor was the wealthiest man in America. How did he make his money? Furs. Furs. And this is our Jeffersonian history. We don't get the fur business because it's North and it's Catholic and it's all kinds of bad things. We want this history of settlement and yeoman farmers settling the country, okay? We don't want to know about that. Anyway, so the Hudson Bay Company is commercial, and they're shipping things back there. Astor has there's a wonderful book, John Jacob Astor and the Astorians or something like that.
Astoria.
Astoria is the name of the book.
Yeah, okay.
That's
Astoria, yeah. Yeah, and he sends two parties, right? One overland and one by sea to go around to establish a port on the West Coast so they don't have to drag all those pelts all the way back to the East Coast.
And what's the oldest city west of the Mississippi?
Santa Fe.
Astoria.
Nope.
Well, that's what it said in the book.
Well, in the United States.
In the United States.
But Santa Fe was a city in
Santa Fe or
1610.
Astoria.
Is Astoria?
Pardon?
Well, it's a divided
Opinion.
opinion.
Astoria is 1811,
Yes.
but
Today's gotta be.
Santa Fe is 1610.
16, yeah, way earlier.
Or was it United States then?
Oh, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't in the United
Oh, this
States.
is the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it might have been Spanish territory. Yeah.
Pardon?
Spanish territory at that time.
Oh, yeah, it was part of Mexico then.
But actually Spanish territory, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you know.
We have a old family story in our family. In the 1830s and 40s, they had come over from Ireland with the Hudson Bay Company. And they weren't so much interested in furs, but I guess somebody came up here and bought horses from old Joseph. Joseph sold horses out of here.
Sold groceries?
Horses.
Horses. Okay, yeah, I'm so,
They would come in
of
here
course,
and buy horses and take them back over the toll gate to is it Walla Walla where the Hudson Bay
they had a post. Yeah, that's very true, Millie, that,
So it wasn't
though
just-
the Nez Perce the Nez Perce did not like trapping beaver.
Yeah.
They didn't like it at all. But they loved horses,
Yeah.
and they raised horses, and they would take them up to Fort Spokane. Beginning in, I think Spokane's about 1810 or 1811 too. And so they started trading horses, yeah. That was their, so there's a book called Children of the Fur Trade, which is about the mixed race people in Oregon the Métis, really, of Oregon. And he has all of these annual fur trips listed on the Snake River and on the Owyhee River. You know why it's the Owyhee? Because there were Hawaiians that were part of it.
Oh, really, is that right?
Yes. And in fact, read the Astoria book, the Hawaiians saved the Astorians cookies. Remember that? That the English and American sailors didn't know how to swim? And so the boat tipped over and the Hawaiians went out and cut the shrouds. Wasn't that the deal there? Anyway, history turns on some small events, right? If those Hawaiians are not on that boat, Astoria maybe doesn't get founded. they go down. Anyway, so that everybody's right. The Vatican was accumulating wealth. The crowns were accumulating wealth. They were sometimes distributing it back down the way to their lords and their, and sometimes they weren't, and sometimes they were fighting with other crowns and competing, and the Pope sets himself up as an arbiter in this whole thing. And then after this happens, and the Columbus's second trip here, they were absolutely brutal. They were brutal to the Indians. They worked them to death in mines. If they didn't produce enough ore in a day, they cut off hands and limbs. And there's one, what's his name? De Casas? There's one guy, it had its own system of slavery, which was not quite slavery, which they said you could have servants, or they could be slaves if they weren't Christian, but once they were Christian, they were servants or something like that. But this one guy, De Casas, goes back. He becomes totally disenchanted with the behavior of the conquerors in the Southwest, and he goes back and writes a bunch of stuff about it. And probably he might be part of the reason that in 1530 or whatever, the Pope says, no, you can't do this anymore. Indians have souls, okay? And you can convert them, but you can't treat them like this. So that happens. So anyway, as the United States develops, first of all, and there's an interesting book called The Rediscovery of America by the first native historian at Yale, Ned Blackhawk. And Coley's listening to it now, and she says, it's too hard to listen to. You got to read it so you can read the page over again, some of them. But what he does is recapture American history and put Indians at the center of it. Now, they don't always win, but they were involved. His argument is that they were involved in all the decisions that led to the growth of the country. And that kind of gets skipped over. For that reason, he starts in the Southwest and starts with, not with the Plymouth, but with the Indians and the Spanish in the Southwest and the growth of Santa Fe and all of that. So anyway, what's happening in our country is people are coming here and what they want is land, right? They left Europe, they didn't have land there, and they come oftentimes as indentured servants. I think Ralph will know this, but about half of the people that came in the 1600s were indentured servants, at least, and they would have 5 years or 7 years to work off, and then they could break off. So
there was a system called peonage also, which sounds a lot like indentured servitude, and actually the word peon comes from that. But that was used, I think, in the Southwest.
And where was that?
Well, in the Southwest.
In the Southwest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They weren't quite slaves, but they would.
Yeah,
they would owe money, and then they were in this.
Yeah.
in a system called peonage.
Yeah, there's a whole different history that, again, we don't get much of in the Southwest. When I get students in here, I say, do you know about the Louisiana Purchase? Oh, yeah, we know about the Louisiana Purchase. How about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? What? And I say that the United States got more land in 1846 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo than it got and it got California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, all that. So,
Was that,
yeah,
was that with Santa Anna?
pardon?
Who was that with, that treaty?
Mexico.
But, okay, Santa Anna was, right, so was he president then?
Let's see, who's president in 1846? Polk? I think it's Polk.
No, I meant Mexico.
Pardon?
The Mexican president.
Oh, I don't know who the president was in Mexico. Yeah, but I think you're right. A peonage is a Southwest, and it's part of that convoluted kind of slave but not slave.
Yeah, yeah.
And the system is called, didn't you learn that in Mexico, Chris? Encomado, and there was a system that,
You have to go back.
anyway. So the first 100 years of our, between 1600 and the first 150 years, we're gradually moving inland from the coast in the northeast, and people are gaining Indian land by war and treaty. There were treaties even before the United States was the United States. There were treaties with individual things. There was also competition between France and England going on in North America, right? And the French, this is another reason we don't know about the fur trade. The French were working the north in the fur trade, okay? The English were a little this way, and the French, basically, they were Catholic. They intermarried with Indians. The Hudson Bay Company, which wasn't Catholic, but would bring priests out. Hudson's Bay Company brought priests out because the voyageurs wanted marriage. The Protestant churches, some of them would not allow a mixed marriage. And Bobby Connor says, oh yeah, the English would they'd take a country wife, and when they got transferred to a different post, they'd leave her there. But the French married and kept her. The French also traded, and the Indians were used to trading, right? They traded amongst themselves all the time. So as the French moved across in the fur trade, they established forts, they intermarried, they actually created in North America, I think, what's the only really melded European and indigenous society, the Métis in Canada and into Montana. And there are still people. The Métis are now a recognized First Nation in Canada. They had their own uprising. They had a bunch of people get hung in the 1800s sometime, but they speak French. They could probably communicate with the Cajuns. They speak a French from the 17th, 18th century. And England doesn't get, England in the War of, I guess it's the War of 1812 is when they get, the French have to essentially take over Canada. Am I right there? Does anybody remember that?
Was that the French-Indian War?
Pardon?
What was the French-Indian War?
French-Indian War?
Yeah, 1812 was with the British.
Was the only, yeah, it must have been the French-Indian War.
Is that when they burned down Washington? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
French-Indian, yeah.
Part of it. And don't forget coming up the Mississippi.
Oh, yeah.
In New Orleans and St. Louis and all that with the French coming in from the south.
That's right.
The French came from the south. Huh?
Yeah, and as Ralph likes to point out, that the Mississippi is the pigs on the Mississippi. Tell us about the pigs on the Mississippi River.
1536, when the Spaniards hit Florida, and they brought pigs along with horses and turned them loose so they would have meat, and herded them along. And of course, the pigs doing what pigs do, they headed for the gardens. And if the Indians looked cross-eyed at the pigs, why, they shot the Indians or enslaved them. And it was in 1912, Wallowa County set a record growing more hogs than any other county in Oregon. And they were all range herded. And hogs in this country, they didn't have cultivated gardens, but we had camas beds, wet meadows. And hogs doing what hogs do, just went and turned them upside down and ate everything.
Wouldn't do well in health.
So pass that one around. So, yeah, so the pigs, and DeSoto doesn't get out alive, but I think his pigs get loose, right?
Yeah.
And so, and the other thing about pigs,
And horses get loose.
yeah, the other thing about pigs is they're good at transmitting diseases to humans. So there's some notion that the pigs are responsible for some of the big disease outbreaks in North America. So anyway, getting on with our little brief history here and getting up to how the Doctrine of Discovery gets to America is the America in 1776 were founded as a nation, and as I said, Jefferson especially is all about surveying the land and dividing it up and selling it to settlers. And we'll get across the country this way. And I believe that most of the history that we got when we were in school, all of us are old enough, I think, was a Jeffersonian history. That the history of the United States is a history of the gradual movement across the country of basically an Anglo-American society, or Northern European American society. And it was made up of these yeoman farmers and who would each have a hunk of land, and the founding document says all men are created equal, and our historians now, Jill Lepore is the primary kind of the New Yorker and Harvard historian, and her book, These Truths, basically says that the history of this country is the working out of our fundamental documents. So all men are created equal, expands to all men, whether they have property, all white men, whether they have property or not. That's the first step. And then pretty soon we take in black men, or not pretty soon, after a few years of struggle. Yeah, Deb.
I'm curious, I grew up north of Hartford, Connecticut, somewhere King Philip's War.
Yeah.
So you're saying we didn't, no, we didn't ever touch that in school officially, but I was aware of it, so I'm curious, we'll come to...
Know about King Philip's War?
No, we all wondered in the locale that people grew up in, were they aware of local,
Oh.
events and so on?
What do you think? How many of you had any, in school, got anything about local Native American?
Or not in school, but from just
Or
living
from being in the...
from a locality.
From your locality?
Actually, that's interesting because I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, never heard anything about Indians really. I mean, you knew there was Indians around, but we didn't know about the tribes. We didn't know about any settlements or anything else. We
Right.
didn't really think about it.
Yeah.
I grew up in California, and we didn't really know very much about Indians, but we knew a lot about Padre Sarah.
That's right.
Yes.
Who, of course,
All the
you know,
missions.
Who were gonna make a saint?
in all the missions and so forth.
Yeah.
And even took a field trip to a few of them, yeah.
Yeah. And we watched Zorro on TV.
But a lot of Padre Sarah, that was a very important part California history, so we had a lot of that in fourth grade.
So you did know about King Philip's War, though?
Well, yeah, because he hid out in a cave in the park that my family used to take hikes in. So, yeah, it was,
Would you educate us about King Philip's War?
King Philip, and I don't know what tribe he was, but he got kind of sick of what was the white folks were doing in his neighborhood, which was Simsbury, Connecticut, and environments, north of Hartford, so north central Connecticut, and started and burned down Simsbury basically, and was eventually subdued. But that is how I knew of him. And then Wampanoag tribe, and
Yeah.
I was aware of a few tribes, but not in the way we would be now. You know, where you have the map of the U.S. and it's,
Yeah.
yeah,
How did King Philip get his name?
that's a good question.
A Catholic missionary.
Well, you know, throughout our history, there's been, you know, let's kill all the Indians, or let's at least take their land. But there has also been a romanticization of Indians. So, let's see, King Philip. Well, I got it, you know, this is where visual is the only way to do it.
Well, even before
You don't want to Google King Philip.
King Philip's War was the Jamestown and the Jamestown Revolt. So Jamestown happened, and what was it, 15 years later, the Indians said this isn't working well, and it just about got them all. And that was, shoot, 60, 80 years before King Philip, as I recall. Even before that, I'm curious about just where this doctrine of discovery was solicited from the Pope. As I recall, was it Brendan? St. Brendan the Navigator in 532 discovered America with his 17 sailors and returned, and he didn't claim any of it. And the Celtiberians that were back and forth from 1200 to 600 BC discovered America and left people here and took people back, and they didn't claim any of it.
So maybe Ireland wasn't paying
So-
the Pope. Maybe they were sending money to the Pope.
Somewhere between St. Brendan and Portugal was fishing the cod banks
Yeah?
off of Newfoundland. Isn't that 700? Yeah.
Oh, really?
AD. You know, so they were back and forth, and other than they made colonies and fish drying camps, they didn't claim much of it.
They were-
Well, but the Catholic Church was not consolidated by 500 or 700,
Right.
you know? I mean, what the Christian church was at that time is they were kind of almost national or state or city
The doctrine of
churches.
Discovery dates to the Catholic Church laying dominion claim over royalty, and you know, they've got the power to grant to the royals the ability to partition the rest of the world, I guess.
Yeah, that's,
Dan, did you learn anything in law school about how the doctrine of discovery got into our legal system?
Not one bit.
Not-
Where did you go to law school?
Remember. University of Oregon.
Oh, that's right.
Rich, I'd like to share that this discussion has helped me realize that I grew up in a small city in western Wisconsin, and, you know, a lot of the geographic place names in the upper Midwest are all either Native American or a lot of French terms too. And yet, you're right, there really wasn't taught too much in schools in history about the people that came before. Even though all over the place, there's historical monuments, there's parks, state and national parks nearby, effigy mounds, if you've ever heard of that place, or there's other places with Indian burial grounds, even in city parks where some of them are preserved, where, right next to the playground where I grew up. And so, but yet, you know, why weren't they really, the only thing that remained in my hometown until very recently was this terrible sculpture that was a 100 and some feet tall sculpture of a Native American that was just a gross caricature by a white artist. And I had that guy. The sculptor was my high school art teacher. And it became very controversial, and eventually the tribes locally forced the city to remove it. And it's still to this day, it's very controversial. He was called the Big Indian, and they had to tear the thing down and remove it and haul it to some private property. It couldn't remain in a city park anymore, and people are still stirred up about that.
So Chris, in Northern California, did you get anything?
Well, growing up in Southern California,
Oh,
we
you grew, yeah.
learned about freeways. How to create a system of moving people. No, I mean, it was basic history. I'm sure that most of us all learned from the same books,
Yeah,
pretty much.
yeah, yeah.
And
They really weren't local books, they were mass-produced by somewhere in a
And
publishing
it's
company back
some
east.
publishing company, and they,
And in my case, in Minnesota, what we didn't learn about was the Mankato hangings. And the biggest and most successful uprising of Indians in North America was in 1862 in Minnesota. And they got up and killed 600 or 700 settlers because they kept squeezing the reservation and making it smaller, smaller. And so they had this big uprising, and they had to divert troops from the Civil War to go and put down this uprising. We got none of that. And they ended up and they sentenced 300 Indians to be hanged. And it went to Lincoln, and Lincoln had some preacher friend of his go through the list, and they got it down to 38. So if you look up Mankato hangings, Mankato, Minnesota built gallows so they could simultaneously hang 38 Indians.
Mankato?
Pardon?
Mankato?
Yes.
Yeah, M-A-N-K-A-T-O. And so that was in 1862. I think it was on Christmas Day or something, they hung these guys. We didn't get it, but I have since had teachers here from Minnesota, and they say, yep, we get it now.
Are they teaching it now?
They're teaching it now. So, you know, I think we've turned a few pages.
I came across an Idaho history book a while back, and
Chris said
the
that
treatment of Indians, but it said there used to be Indians here, but they're gone.
Left in California.
They're gone now, yeah.
Except way up north, there's Ishi last of his tribe.
The Ishi last of his
Maybe,
tribe.
maybe in North.
Yeah,
Northern
I'm talking about
California,
near Mount Lassen area.
Yes.
Yeah, at the
Yes.
Feather River Canyon. And I only know because I taught there. There's, oh, and so did Ginger.
Yeah.
The Maidu, we had the Maidu in Plymouth County.
Where did you grow up, Ginger?
Actually, I grew up in Minnesota
Oh,
till
that's
I was
right.
12.
We both taught
And
in the
then-
same county.
Right, and then we lived a couple years in Colorado Springs and then came up to California.
whereabouts in California?
Plymouth County. Yeah, at the Feather River Canyon.
Right.
Yeah, near Lassen.
So anyway, getting back to kind of U.S. history and what's happening about 1800 and 1830, we've got various Indian uprisings and Jackson goes down to which wars it? Jackson, before he was president, fought in which Indian war? In Florida, right?
Seminole?
Seminole.
Seminole War.
Yeah.
Seminole War. Okay. So anyway, Jackson decides that he's gonna get rid of the Indian problem by creating a territory for them west of the Mississippi. And he's gonna remove all the Indians from the east of the Mississippi and put them west of the Mississippi.
Wasn't that right after the Red Stick War
Yep,
with the Choctaw and the Cree?
yep, yep, yeah.
And yet it was his Cherokee battalion that saved his ass in the Red Stick War.
Yeah, what's really interesting is right up through the Civil War, I mean, the Cherokees were divided in the Civil War, and half of them fought on one side and half of them fought on the other. But the Indians were always sought as, you know,
Some help, some.
yeah, that help from the Indians, yeah. But at any rate, there was also a coincidence of interest, because Jackson didn't want Indians getting in his way anymore. And the southern plantation guys, they were planting cotton, which is a pretty heavy feeder, so they needed new land. And the Cherokees had a bunch of land, right? And so they passed the Indian Removal Act.
Trail
Okay.
of Tears.
Pardon?
Trail of Tears.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
That led to the Trail of Tears.
Right.
And I gave my book on it to Ralph, and he said he couldn't stand it. He could only read a page or two at a time. It's called Unholy what? Unholy. I don't know. Anyway, it's about Indian removal, and it's written by it's a kind of an academic book. But one of the things he points out is that we were basically as good as the Nazis about keeping track of our expenses, and so that on Indian removal, we actually, United States made money. That it cost $73 million to remove all these Indians. We kept track of how much we paid for the ox carts.
Hitler actually studied American history because he wanted to emulate, and he admired the way that these Americans were able to move west by gathering the land and removing the indigenous. And of course, he wanted to move east and remove the Jews, but he actually looked at American history. I know that was yeah. We'll keep that quiet.
So in the course of that, not only were the Cherokee and the Choctaw removed, and some of them hid out in spaces down there in the swamplands and moved around and intermarried with slaves and whatnot, but they also took Indians from they marched the Powhatamies across Wisconsin, right? Or Ohio? Were they a little south of you? South of you. But he'll tell you in this book how many died on the march out to Indian Territory. But about the same time then, so they moved all these Indians, and they trying to make way for us to fill up the east of the Mississippi. Jefferson, by the way, is already thinking about west of the Mississippi and sends out his surveyors to start surveying it. But at any rate, during that period, from 1823 through the 1830s, the Chief Justice was John Marshall. And John Marshall comes around and he shepherds 3 opinions through the Supreme Court, which basically are the basis now of Indian law in America. Okay? And the first one is 1823, and that's when, let's see, it's Marbury? I forget.
Jonathan versus
Yeah.
McIntosh.
No,
John's versus McIntosh.
Cherokee Nation versus Georgia.
what he basically says, and that's what's brilliant in this book, is he says that no longer the monarchs own the land, the country, the United States, owns all the land. Okay? And because the United States owns the land, what are we going to do with these Indians who were on the land? He says, Indians are occupants of the land. And they're not owners, but they're occupants of the land. And they have, in this series of decisions, one of them is about the Cherokees and their ability to stay on the land. And anyway, that's where he famously decides with the Cherokees, and President Jackson says, okay, you enforce it. And so that law doesn't get, or that interpretation doesn't get standing right then. But the clever thing, and I passed this one out, and on the Ray Cross is this lawyer who as a 29-year-old lawyer for Native American Rights Fund, wins the Klamath water rights back after the Klamath are reinstated, and he argues before the Supreme Court, and he is in the pages in this book, and I'll pass you out this page. He is saying that Marshall basically saved the Indians' hide in America, because he said, okay, they're just occupants, but number one, states can't take lands from Indians, individuals can't take lands from Indians. The only entity that can deal with Indian lands is the United States Congress, okay? And we take up in this treaty period, right?
If you're
He
saying,
said-
if you're saying that, then when he said tribal sovereignty, sovereignty implies that they were a country separate from America, right?
Within a country.
Yes, he
But if they were-
acknowledges, but he calls
So
it,
they owned the land
he
as a
calls it
sovereignty,
limited
right?
sovereignty,
Huh?
okay? And that's the part of the law that's enforced to this day. In other words, an Indian tribe cannot make war on Canada. It does not have the right. A sovereign nation, one nation could make a war on another nation, but an Indian tribe can't do that.
The tribal sovereignty implies that they were here before America.
No, the sovereignty just implies that they were a separate nation, yes.
So America didn't own it all. They had ownership through
No,
sovereignty.
he does not acknowledge their ownership. He says because of the doctrine of discovery, and as he says here, he says, Marshall does something really ingenious and unique in the Georgia opinion. He says, look, these Indian tribes are domestically dependent sovereign nations, but nothing in our own constitution or in the existing body of law governing European nations gets me out of the woods. So what I'm going to do is borrow the existing concept of sovereignty, and I'm going to bifurcate it. I'm going to cut it in half, okay? I'm going to apply the domestic rights and privileges of nationhood to the tribes. From here forward, they will retain all the domestic rights to self-regulation and governance that pertain to any sovereign nation. But what they give up in this deal is the rights of foreign sovereign, okay?
Rights of what?
Pardon?
Foreign?
Foreign, of
So
a
they
foreign.
make them domestic sovereign?
Yeah, domestic,
Yeah.
that's a term they use.
So they can sell cigarettes, they can sell gasoline, they can tax themselves, they can run their own health, they can do all kinds of things internally, okay?
Build casinos.
Pardon?
Build casinos.
Build
Casinos,
casinos.
yes.
Yeah, they were allowed.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
That took a
yes,
couple of lawsuits.
yeah. Yeah.
And they're not subject to the control by the individual state in which they reside.
That's right. They're not subject to, when any kind of, here, if you find human remains on your land, Ralph, you are required to go not to the state government, okay? No, wait a second. If you find it on your, you can go to the state government. But if it's on Forest Service land, they have to go to the Nez Perce tribe, because it has to be a government to government relation. You're under the state on private ground, but the Forest Service is government ground, and it goes So the dealings here are, on private ground, our dealings are with the Umatilla tribe oftentimes. But on Forest Service ground, the dealings are always with the Nez Perce tribe. Am I correct there,
What about
Ralph?
state land?
Pardon?
What about on state land?
State land, I would assume would be,
State land deals with Oregon State Historic Preservation.
that's right,
Which deals directly with the Umatilla Rose.
yeah, yeah.
Now, what about within the, thanks, within a sovereign tribal property, can the individual tribe members actually have deeds to private land?
Yes. That comes about with it's called the Dawes Allotment Act in the 1870s. And this was one of the attempts to break up Indian lands, to take away that, that.
Make them smaller and give everybody a piece of the
Well,
smaller bit.
no, and also to assimilate
Give
them.
your deed to the little
Even Marshall is, in this book, he admits that Marshall thought that over time, Indians would be assimilated and become, like everybody else. And that allotment period was one of the big periods of assimilation. And what we'll do is every Native American on their reservation can have 80 acres per person, or 160, whatever the family arrangement was, in exchange for which, and they can't sell that land to anybody else for 25 years, and they start paying taxes immediately on it, okay?
paid tax.
And so that, and then that actually comes to the last big attempt to assimilate Indians in the United States is the 1950s, when we have the Termination Act. They tried to terminate the Menominee. That was the big one, because they wanted their timber, and the Klamath, because they wanted their timber. And those, one of the things that's in Ned Blackhawk's book that I never thought of, he said part of the impetus for that in the 1950s was, again, it was the Cold War, right? And so what were we afraid of? We were afraid of communists. And what were communists? They had communal lands. And Indian tribes had communal lands, so we didn't want that. We wanted all the land in private ownership. So that was part of the, he makes the argument that was part of the impetus for the Termination Act in the 1950s. It's funny, yeah, our history, it winds around. And Ralph, I could not find the photos in there that I wanted, but we named not only King Philip, but we had, what was the other one? Hendrik. Was he a king or prince? King Hendrik? Anyway, we named them. We took them to Europe, and their portraits were painted, and they're somewhere in this work, and they're wearing swords. They look like, they're dressed up like English royalty, right? So there was this constant, we have always had mixed emotions about our relationships with Indians. And when I talk to students, I said, how many people have you ever talked to who you thought were a wannabe slave? And did you play slaves and masters as a kid? No, you played cowboys and Indians. And Indians, there was always this romantic thing about Indians as well. And so they did things like that. They dressed up their life. But on the other hand, you had these, like the Termination Act, and what I didn't say there is that the land that was not allotted was deemed surplus and could be sold. And some, am I right, 90 million acres were sold as a result of, to private white, well, mostly white individuals as a result of the Termination Act. But this ambivalence towards Indians, a young man who graduated from Joseph High School and is a senior at Linfield College was in yesterday, and he's writing his senior thesis on Chief Joseph Day. Oh, wow. But what he's interested in is how we've used and abused Indians. You know, how we could kick the Indians out of here in 1877 and in 1880, 3 years later, name the town Joseph, right? How Chief Joseph days, I doubt, you'd have to look, but I doubt that anybody ever asked any Indian whether we could name the rodeo Chief Joseph days, you know. It's interesting, Barney Locke, you know, was one of the guys that started the fly-in here, and they wanted to name it Thunder in the Mountains, but they asked. They asked the Indians, and the Indians said, no, please don't. So they didn't, you know. So there's a change in attitude over the.
So what remnants of these laws, the doctrine and everything still exist today and are being
Well,
perhaps misused or need to be changed?
well, I think the ones that are, the Indians have a whole bunch of lawyers now
Yeah.
in their camp.
They are lawyers.
And I think the most glaring, or the most important decision based on treaties is fishing rights. And actually the rehabilitation of fish runs. So that's an ongoing thing. If the fish get back, and if the sockeye get back in Wallowa Lake, it's a result of the Treaty of 1855. And that, what Marshall said is treaties are substantial and important documents. And the treaty said that the Indians can fish, hunt, graze, and graze their ponies and their cows in concert with the citizenry. That was in the 1855 treaty and also in 1863. So in the 1970s, the fishing wars in the Northwest, Judge Bolt sent his staff out to look for dictionaries. He said, what does in common with mean in 1850? And they came back and says, it means shared equally. He said, okay, the Indians get half the fish. And so that's the reason. And then the further argument is, if the treaty says that they get to hunt and fish as part of their livelihood, then there've got to be fish, right? So therefore, our Nez Perce Fisheries over here is funded by Bonneville Power Administration, and it's funded to restore fish that are guaranteed to them by treaty.
But this last year, somebody said that Bonneville Power is out of it now, that the money goes directly to the tribes. Is that not true?
I don't.
There was Biden made it was in the tribal paper, Biden made a thing that from now on, the money that comes from the feds goes directly to the tribes and does not go through Bonneville Power.
Well, I don't know, but you know, Biden did just say, what was it, $2 billion? Towards, he said that we have to have salmon in the Columbia River. He did not go so far as to say we have to dismantle dams, but he said.
No, but he just said their money for rehabilitation goes directly to the tribes. It no longer goes to the dams.
Well,
I thought
that could
that was
be.
amazing.
Well, Biden did come up with this whole $2 billion that would have been direct federal subsidies.
Right. And
that wouldn't have gone, so that's being allotted, I'm sure, to tribes.
Tribes, yeah, and that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of bad feelings about Biden because of that in Oregon.
A lot of bad feelings about Biden?
In Oregon because of giving the money directly to
Not a money in
the tribes rather than to the dams to give to the tribes. You know, the dams used to give it to the tribes.
Yeah.
So it was sort of a paternalistic role.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Now
okay.
they've taken that out of it.
Okay, well,
So,
that's an interesting, yeah.
there's a lot of, there's a lot of anger about that in Oregon.
Well, we like our power. Well, it's all, you know, I think
It's like our own dam. Haskell, who was our state senator, now Nash, has, they attempted to change the definition of fish passage that's been in place for 50 years. on the Columbia in ODF and W's state law, fish passage was always had to do with fish ladders on the Columbia. And recently Haskell changed it, put an or in there, said or catch and carry, because they directly don't want a fish ladder on our dam.
Yeah,
They want the tribes to have to pay to take the fish around.
I think it's,
It's interesting how all this parental
yeah, I think
disrespect for
that,
sovereignty is right here. In our landowners are here fighting us already.
I think it's,
With tribal
what you say is true, but it's way more complicated than that. The one set of engineers came up with that catch and carry, and at one point, before Shannon Wheeler, the tribe, the Nez Perce tribe assented to that. And the local people here grabbed onto that. And I know that because I got a phone call from Umatilla who said, the next time you do a program, please let me come and talk. The Nez Perce are going for catch and carry.
So they,
Okay, and this was 3 years
Isn't
ago.
that interesting, Umatilla has appealed it. They don't want catch and carry. So
Of course,
Nez Perce
and no,
and
that's what,
Umatilla are
no,
fighting.
no. I'm saying that they said, Umatilla said, in fact, he said, I got 2 million of those dollars for that dam reconstruction, and I do not want capture and carry. I want a fish ladder. And the Nez Perce tribe at that time, 3 years ago, had in their works catch and carry. When Shannon Wheeler came in, he said, bullshit. It's gonna be volitional. So it's
So what is it now then? That was 3 years ago.
well, it's
being-
probably on the way to the courts,
It's
right?
being, no, it's being, the
Not
court, it's already
decided.
in court. The definition that ODF and W is trying to change right now is already still in court. They haven't been able to change the definition that you could have either or. It's still the old way. Have you heard how that
No,
court case is
no.
going?
No.
But hasn't Shannon Wheeler said, if they don't have a fish ladder, it's not gonna get built, because we're gonna fight it all the way to,
Yeah, yeah. And it's even more complicated than that because the irrigation company is saying it could easily be built on the Hayes property, Hayes land, and the Hayes said, no, you've got property on the other side, we don't want it. So, you know, it's a really complicated,
Well, it's interesting that we're all right, you know, we're talking about 1400. We're right here in the midst of it right now.
sure.
I mean, we go to
Yeah.
Chief Joseph Days, we have Indian friends, we go call them king, or we call them, you know, our friends and everything. Meanwhile, in the courts, they're fighting over a dam and water.
Dan?
Nothing has changed, nothing's changed.
On that same idea of what's going on right now, when I was working in the courthouse, we had to decide what the 1855 and 63 treaties allowed for Indians in this county to hunt on land. And it was still being argued over, and I don't know what's come out of it now.
Well, there was one, I think it was specifically about, I mean, the Nez Perce from Idaho and the people from Walla Walla have been hunting and fishing here forever, okay? But it was a question of the people at Nez Pelham. I think the case was a Nez Pelham Indian shot a deer or an elk here, and it went to court, and Valentine ruled on it.
I don't know what land, but was it, who owned the land? The state or individuals?
I think it was on federal land.
Federal,
Okay, and the argument here, and I've heard some Nez Perce from Lapway say, they signed on with, they're part of Colville now, and they took a cash payment for salmon, and so they can't hunt and fish here.
Well, they explained that once already in that, Soy told us one time, we had a wealthy lady come in here and want to give money to the Nez Pelham group at Chief Joseph Day. And he visited with them and he said, well, you know, if you give me money up here in Nespelem, we are considered executive order treaty, no, they're not treaty reservations. We're executive order
Right.
reservation. And there's 12 tribes up there. And Joseph was dumped up there with, he said, if you give me land or money down here in Wallowa County, everybody in Colville owns it. All the other 12
Yeah.
tribe owns it. So he said, they really hurt us. They hurt the Joseph band forever coming back here, because if they were given land or money, they wouldn't be able to accept it without the entire tribe up there having to be part of it. They would have to, the whole tribe. So when Lapway had fish issues, it came up again that they were executive order. They have a right to fish here, but so does everybody else on that reservation up there. That would mean all the Colvilles have a right
Right.
to fish here.
Well, it's
the way the
obviously a
was set
sticky,
up.
it's obviously a sticky wicket. And basically what I believe, Millie, and I don't know, Ralph and I've been,
Have you ever read about an executive order?
yeah, I know that
reservation?
it's an.
Are there any other ones than Colville?
Yeah, well, the Yakima Reservation, Nez Perce and Umatilla reservations and the Flathead Reservation are all Stevens Treaty
Or
reservations.
treaties, yeah.
It, Colville is executive order, which means that, they can dump they put the Palouse on there more recently.
Yeah.
There was an attempt at an executive order reservation here
Oh,
in 1873. And Joseph and Ollicott were promised basically half of the Wallowas. And so they stopped settlement from 1873 to 1875. They went so far as to establish land or improvement values. And by 1875, the Modoc War was under control. They were afraid of that. They were afraid Joseph would go down and join them. And there were more settlers in here. The settlers kept coming in, so they rescinded it. But it's called an executive order for a reservation for the roaming Nez Perce of the Wallowa Valley in Oregon. And
could they ever resurrect them?
well, it's an executive order.
Could someone else make another executive order and I mean, if they're executive order up there, could someone make an executive order and bring it down here?
I don't know. They talk to the president. Talk to the president.
Well, the trouble with executive orders, if it's for that administration, anybody else can take it off.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So the next administration.
Yeah, and the land ownership is much more complicated now. You couldn't easily
do an
take away
executive
all
order.
the private lands that are embedded within state and federal and everything. It's all mixed up, so you
What is
don't have big chunks of territory to easily divide up.
What is happening is co-management, so that the Yurok, for instance, are co-managing a portion of the Redwood National Forest with the tribe. And there's been talk about co-management even here, hasn't there, Ralph, about, I think, in terms of grazing, there's been talk of co-management of tribal and U.S. government. And there's some co-management ideas, I think, in Idaho, too.
Yeah, Joe McCormick's got a bunch of cows down there on
Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife instituted or initiated a memorandum of understanding signed by the governor about co-management of wildlife resources, which includes the Nez Perce tribes in Oregon. Washington State has done something very similar, so the recognized tribes in the state are designated co-managers of the wildlife resource and the fisheries resource. And it's like a new authority. It doesn't
It
provide.
takes away from their treaty rights, to me. It makes
Well,
takes away from
I
it.
think what's happening, Millie, is that there's a great deal of sympathy for Indian causes across the United States now. It's not just here. So people are working on, we've got Indian appointees. I mean, the National Park Service is Chuck Sams from Umatilla. And so they're making deals across the country, not just here. This is nationwide, what's happening.
It's another layer of co-management between the federal government and the respective tribal governments
Yeah,
on national park lands.
right, right, right.
And I haven't heard that that's extended to national forest or BLM or other national, what would it be, federal refuge lands. I haven't heard that it's extended to any of those yet, but it may.
And the other thing is that there are, there have been private donations of land and private donations of easement to the Nez Perce tribe. It's now pretty clear to the agencies and nonprofits in the county here that the Colville Nez Perce have been left out. And so they are now involved in conversations about land usage and transfer.
Again, because they're executive order rather than treaty.
No,
Rather than
yeah.
treaty reservations.
Exactly, because they
They
no,
have to be handled differently.
it's because they're enrolled at Colville, and Colville has its own, whether it was an executive order treaty or not, Colville is the 12 tribes, as you said, and the Nez Perce are a small part of it. But their hunting and fishing rights are defined by that reservation, not by and what some of the Lapwai Nez Perce are saying, they threw their lot in with Colville. So therefore, they do not get the privileges that we have here in the Willow.
I don't know why the Nez Perce get the privileges. They signed the 1863 treaty that gave up their privileges to here.
No, 1863 treaty,
Some did.
Some did, that's.
some rights. It still had fishing and hunting and grazing in usual and accustomed places.
Did it still have all that?
Yep.
They
In
just gave
usual
up
and
the
accustomed
actual
places.
land base?
Usual and accustomed places has come to mean unclaimed lands. In other words, lands owned by the US government.
Right,
Okay.
and is that still the situation? Because 30, 40 years ago it was, and we went to court because there was an argument of Nez Perce Indians hunting on private land or county land, and saying that they had the right to do that by the 63
Oh.
treaty. And it got decided in several places over in Pendleton and here, that it had to be federal land to allow unlimited hunting and fishing. So, but I don't know, that's why I asked the question a little while ago, if you knew of any change in that. Because the tribes were trying to say, no, we should be able to hunt on any land, private land or state land or any of that.
I don't know, Dan, whether that has been,
I've been away from it too long.
yeah, I don't know whether there's been,
But we had some pretty good fights in court over that. So,
yeah. Well, look at folks, I hope I didn't talk too much and I enjoyed your comments and
Thank you, Rich.
contributions.
Tip jar, guys, right here.
Okay, yeah, tip jar, and eat up the rest of my banana bread and all the donuts you want.
Great.
And find these doggone, I wish I could, well, Ralph, you could look at the other paintings, early paintings of American Indians. And these are early, that's 1600s, you know.
One subject to go along with this would be the development along the Mississippi River, because there's, New Orleans had, 5 flags flying over it at one time. St. Louis was about the same.
Yeah.
And involving the Indians too.
Oh.
The resident natives.
There's another book, it's called Indigenous America. It's by a Finnish writer who teaches at Oxford.
Oh, yeah.
And he makes the argument that in 1776, there were 2 rising nations in North America. There was the infant United States, and there were the Sioux, the Lakota. And the Lakota were in the Great Lakes, and they gradually came across, and they got guns and horses on the way, and they controlled the Mississippi from Canada to New Orleans.
So it-
And
They
they,
did, yeah.
yeah, and the United States government wanted to deal with them because it didn't want to deal with all these little tribes. And so the government actually vaccinated, you know, that pre-vaccination for smallpox.
Oh, yeah.
The Nez Perce, or the Lakota.
Oh, yeah, okay. Interesting.
So,
Well, I lived in St. Louis for a while, and that history was still there.
oh, yeah.
Very much so. It
Yeah.
was fun to experience it, but I was only there a year, so.
Yeah, she's in and out. And
Came back and came to Wallowa County.
she's gonna.
Is that right? You were there for how long?
Just a year after getting out of law school, I worked for the eastern half of the state appellate court in Missouri, so, out of St. Louis.
Huh.
Good to see you.
I wish I could find that goddamn, there's one of them, but there's one that's just so
Dressed
great.
in the British regalia, is that what you meant?
Yeah, all dressed up in this,
So she lives past Nancy.
So she comes to
but this, you know, I'm really proud of this kid from Joseph going and writing. And so we were talking about,
yeah,
well-
I just didn't know how it was set up. She's there all winter.
David Weaver says that even that first reburial of Joseph,
I'm
we think, well, that's the do-gooders that said, well, this guy's, he said there were people that were wanting to promote that as a tourist deal, you know?
If somebody
And then in the 1840s, or 1940s, when the Indian CCC camp built the rock walls up there, and they had all
I just
the,
saw him yesterday, I was up there
Pardon?
walking, I was just up there walking along that, all of that
Yeah.
yesterday.
Well, you have to understand too,
yeah, and, thanks for
Interesting
coming.
that there are two different dates that
Yeah,
old Chief Joseph died,
Yeah.
right? 60 and 62, right?
You know, Rich, what was interesting, you know, Nancy and I just went back to Bear Paw.
right?
And what was interesting is when the people started to talk about things,
Yeah,
they started to speak about things, and one thing that came out after person is, get over it, let's move
they
on.
don't know what it is, it could be long.
It was very interesting to hear them say that this happened, that happened. We did this, we did that, they did that, they did that. Let's get over it,
The
move
first one
on.
that they showed us at work.
well, I
That was
think,
interesting.
Tourist thing.
I think the fight between,
But yeah, he's been extreme.
the differences
So we don't
between
know.
the Nez Perce at Umatilla and Colville and Laughlin,
You know how they always have the meetings.
I think they're gonna be resolved here,
Oh, for the whole.
because this is neutral territory.
There's like two a year.
Okay. And I
kept-
think
they
we've gotta
canceled
let them
two.
resolve it themselves.
Yes. Yes.
Usually Nancy
You know, we
sends
can't
out
step in and
about, oh,
say,
there's gonna
Yeah.
be a major meeting, but I never saw
No,
any.
no, the one that was supposed to happen this.
well, I highly recommend that book.
It's just.
You're a Midwesterner, you would be,
Because I mean, it's all.
So Mankato is 155 miles from my
That's right.
hometown,
That's right.
lacrosse.
The board-
oh, really?
Yeah, board members are supposed to come.
Because now like.
Pretty
tribal
close, just
sometimes-
There's
right
a,
through Rochester and keep
I don't
going
know, did
west
they ever
a
get
bit.
representatives
there's a chapter on Mankato in Josephi's book on the Civil War.
on the board?
I
Civil
don't know
War
the
in the
answer to
West?
that. Mel might know, or she would know, but.
Okay, I've gotta go up and do
That part of
a
the problem
damn
is.
Zoom meeting.
is
All right, good luck, thanks, great
And they don't
discussion
wanna do
today.
Thanks for
6
coming
hours
in.
over at Colville. And so there's a turnover there. But yeah, I kept asking too, when are the meetings? Because I'd like to sit down and listen to what everybody else to say. And so the last one got canceled. So I don't know, Rich would know because he's one of the board members.
Are you gonna try to volunteer here, or
Are you
gonna
kidding?
take a break?
I just signed up for the watercolor class, which is at 4 o'clock today. I gotta go home and eat lunch and then come back. No, I take off during the winter because I read to the elementary schools here in Enterprise. And so I can't do that. But I also work with 4th grade classes to teach about the Nez Perce during the school year.
Oh, so you
So-
have all that school stuff.
Yeah, and so I started in Naha and I went to Wallowa. This last year was Enterprise and they had 2 4th grades. And now I'm at Joseph Charter School, doing 4th grade there. So I really tried to get the Nez Perce stuff to the 4th grade levels. And then I'll start over again. So I told Sharon Warren, I go, okay, I think this year I'm coming back to Naha, because she only has like 6 or 7 kids. But they change, some of the ones that were there are older, but she's got a couple new kids, so that'll be kind of fun. But yeah, I really want to get a curriculum developed. And that's why I worked with Rich, just to try to get the teacher boxes out. Because the teachers need the resources, and teachers don't